My project is titled Parking Impacts and Optimization in Los Angeles, a case study of Hollywood. Really what it should be called is parking. It's a lot worse than you think. So why parking? Parking, what may seem sort of like a common nuisance for a lot of us, is actually something that has a lot of unnoticed impacts. The one I focus on the most is emissions, and this is a result of anytime you're driving around looking for parking, this is causing additional emissions that you wouldn't have otherwise if you knew exactly where you were going to park. There's also a lot of land use impacts because parking takes up space, so it shapes how our cities form. And there are also economic impacts that stem from us enforcing building projects to have parking built in, which increases the cost of that building, and then that can translate into increased rents for businesses and for people. And then there are also health impacts that result from these emissions, like additional particulate matter or carbon monoxide. So I worked with a Los Angeles startup called Pavement, and Pavement is essentially the Airbnb for parking. They allow people to offer up unused parking space they may have for other people to come park at for an afternoon or so. And by doing this, they're optimizing the existing stock of parking, which is really important because they're not adding any more space. They're really just saying, let's open this up so that someone else can use it. And so any user using it basically knows exactly where they're going to park before they leave, meaning they're not going to cruise at all. So really briefly, the way I sort of structured this project was a pretty in-depth literature review, and I especially wanted to look for any sort of existing models of parking, how decision-making goes into it, how it sort of works within a city. And then I wanted to take these different elements from these existing models and basically try to estimate the supply, demand, and the emissions due to parking in Hollywood. Pavement, the client, was really interested in understanding what kind of positive impact, or if there is any impact that's kind of due to their platform. So I really wanted to build a sort of toolkit for them to use, repeat the methods that I use to be able to do case studies in other places. And then finally, I sort of wrote up a report to summarize all of it and to help them to utilize the toolkit. So something that's really important I mentioned earlier is minimum parking requirements. So these are requirements in the building code that essentially require a building of a certain size to have so many parking spaces, or for every apartment there's 2 parking spaces. This graphic is sort of meant to help you visually understand how this measures out. And so if we require 1 parking space per 1,000 square feet, you can see there's more of a usable building space than there is parking. But if we go all the way down, 10 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is what LA requires for restaurants, we can see there's much more parking than usable building space. The other thing is that I found something that was really sort of, surprising, or that I think is really interesting is when we think about something like a parking shortage, there's not enough parking, I have to drive around and look for it. It's not necessarily an absolute shortage of space. It's more of a how we regulate who can park when and where. And so this is a deep simplification, but I think the idea is that things like office space, like professional buildings and houses, there's regular times of the day when this space is not being used, but no one can park there unless they're sort of a resident there. On the opposite side, commercial space, a lot of times it's used more often and sort of with less regular timing. And so the idea is that we want to try to use these times when spaces are not in use and make them usable, which is what Pavement does. So a bit about the area, Hollywood. Basically, we decided to take a subset of Hollywood. There's a lot of definitions of what Hollywood is, but we took 2 zip codes from Hollywood that sort of this mixed-use development. This area has high population density and high tourism rates, which definitely makes the parking problems worse. I was able to estimate that there are about 64,000 parking spaces within this area based on these minimum parking requirements. And so this is enough square footage to basically add up to about 46% of the entire area, which is a lot of space. But despite this space, there are about 46,000, I estimated there are about 46,000 cruisers per day, so that many people are looking for parking and just sort of driving around trying to find it, which generates about 14,000 metric tons of CO2 a year, just from people trying to look for parking. I also found that the parking area to sort of green space, like parks, that sort of thing, is about 10 to 1 in the area, which I think is just sort of to show how much we sort of value storing our cars over having sort of natural space that I think makes the city more livable. And then as far as pavement goes, I think I estimated that their impact based on their current stock and sort of participation in the area is at only about 0.5%, which is pretty low. But I think that as they grow their sort of user base, both in terms of people who want to find convenient parking, but also in terms of people who are able to offer it, this can grow dramatically. So I think just some of the key takeaways from this are that parking, the shortages and the problems we have with it, a lot of times are due to the regulations on who can park when and where. Through us driving around, cruising, looking for parking, we emit a lot of extra CO2. It can also increase the price of housing in an area and take up space that could be used for things like parks or green space that definitely make a dense city more livable. And so I think this leaves a lot of room for market solutions like what pavement's trying to do to overall improve, to mitigate these impacts. But I also think that it sort of points to a larger issue, which is that we built this into our policies over the 20th century. And I think now that with such a car-centric society, there's a lot of room for improvement, and parking should no longer sort of be ignored as I think it has been in the past relatively. So thank you.
Okay, questions?
Olivia.
Yeah,
I have a question about, so when you're, with this app, you're reducing your hassle cost for the car user, and I'm curious about like below that mitigation. So for example,
this is the big question that a lot of people are sort of raising initially is it going to make parking so easy that more people drive and therefore actually increase the emissions on a net? And I thought about this a lot because I think there's not a lot of, I wasn't able to find a lot of sort of existing resources that sort of directly spoke to this. But I think that based on the size of the cost of sort of this inconvenience of parking relative to all these other things, I think that at least on the scale that sort of we can see now, it wouldn't have a net increase in emissions. But I can't necessarily rule that out. I think that, I guess I'm sort of tending to believe that people, especially in some place like Los Angeles, are going to drive regardless because there's a lot of sort of public perception that the public transportation there is not as good. And I think this is sort of like geared towards, especially working in Los Angeles, is something that people would sort of drive anyway. But I think that that's sort of the big question that I'm recommending to them to keep in consideration because ultimately that is sort of I think one of the larger, I guess, like risks involved. Yeah.
Good presentation. I enjoyed it. Got me to think about something. I guess I had a very detailed question. What's a cruiser? How did you define a cruiser?
So in the literature, there's sort of this...
There's literature on cruisers.
Yes, so...
I learned something.
not necessarily.
Not like you're in our day.
So basically, I'm not sure who kind of coined the term, but there's a UCLA professor, Donald Shoup, who is really the driver of saying we need to take away these minimum parking requirements, and he's the one who's kind of done formative studies on cruising. It's essentially just, you can define it in a more technical way. I didn't, because I didn't do as much of an in-depth simulation kind of model like some others did. Basically, I was just trying to say, I based what a cruiser is on, did you show up when to a building when there's no more parking? So I essentially used a model that took the popular times data from Google and I made some assumptions, and I said, if it's this busy, then their parking is taken, and someone's going to have to basically cruise around and look for parking. So it is something that I think you could sort of say oh, if you're within 100 feet of your location and you start looking for parking, are you cruising yet, even though you're not quite there? But it's something that I think that hasn't really been nailed down yet, which is maybe one of the issues with why this is also difficult.
Well, that's what made me think about personally when I'm driving to look for a parking spot. How long before I'm thinking I've crossed into that category of being a cruiser?
Yeah, and I think you can define it as almost immediately. If you pass your location, then you're starting to cruise.
Yeah.
But I think the idea is that like, if you know exactly where you're going to go before you start, then you don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
So.
I'm trying to imagine you counting the 64,000 spaces as you didn't do that.
No.
Oh, I see, just one for Mexico.
Yeah.
Actually, that's the neighborhood where my son lives, so I'd like to get how do I get the app?
Well, if you're an iPhone user, it's available. You can go to pavement.com.
Oh, well,
But
all right. One more question, but after that.
yeah.
So, this might be beyond your project, but it's just a question that I thought is interesting, and being a planner, it's something that has interested me, is that when you're making some things like these, where you can predict how much, you could predict how much carbon you're emitting out of the atmosphere, have you pondered upon the fact in terms of what California is doing in terms of carbon trading, and how this company could probably make a case that it can get carbon credits?
That's a good.
This is the reason why I asked this, is just simply that in order to make sure that there is enough leverage for such companies to succeed in a carbon place, you need as much ways of revenues needed. So.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of that. It's a really interesting thought, and I think they would probably need a bit more in-depth exploration that I wasn't really able to get to for this, especially in terms of like really proving the causality, because I think to Olivia's point, like there are some uncertainties as far as this goes, and I think arguments can be made either way, and so to participate in something as official as like a sort of cap and trade program, you definitely need to be able to like really in a hard way prove quantitatively like this is causing this, or we are mitigating this amount of carbon based on these other things. So I think that's something that I'd like to talk to them about and see if they're interested in, but I think there's definitely like more work that needs to be done before that kind of thing can be implemented. Yeah.
It's great. And just one question. It seems like we're looking at the relatively technology neutral future, right? Have you done scenarios of different kinds of new mobility, like small two-wheel electric, things like that?
No, so I didn't think of that. That's an interesting point. I did start to look into what the sort of electricity costs would be for electric cars, not just sort of like gasoline. But yes, this was sort of under the assumption of like current, like market, like dispersed technology. But that certainly is something. I have talked to them about sort of how they see autonomous vehicles, and I think they've kind of been looking into positioning themselves as a place where an autonomous vehicle, like some sort of cab, can sort of rest, I guess, when it's not needed to be around anywhere, because they want to optimize it so that it's available to anyone, but they don't want it to just drive around if no one is going to hail a ride or something. So.
Well, as you probably heard, there's an epidemic of electric scooters in Santa Monica right now. These kind of things go forward along with shared vehicles. Both the spatial and the emissions characteristics are going to change.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a big question in Los Angeles, especially as being one of the more car-centric major cities in the U.S., is the penetration of those types of things going to get large enough to displace a system as large as like the current infrastructure system, which is really just all for cars, right? So I think that's definitely something that's good to think about.